Hello, and welcome to Accessibility Talks. I'm your host, Carrie Fisher, and if you're joining us for the first time today, here's the format we try to follow. The presenter will give a short 20 to 30-minute presentation on the topic of the month, and then we'll have time to ask the presenter questions. So if you have a question, please post it in the chat area or tag it on Twitter with the hashtag A11yTalks, spelled A11yTalks. Today, we are lucky to have the Drupal Accessibility Core Maintainer, Andrew Macpherson, joining us live from the UK to talk about what's new with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Welcome, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm really glad to be here. Thanks for everyone who's turning up, and it's great that we've got these sessions recorded for posterity or people who can't be here right now. I'm going to share my screen soon as I've got the right window. Hi, so this is my slides and we'll start on. So thanks, Carrie, for the introduction. I'm Andrew Macpherson. I'm actually one of two core accessibility maintainers. There's been a few of us over the years, but I currently share this role with Mike Gifford. And I've been doing the core accessibility maintainer role for a couple of years now. And when I started on it, I thought, well, you know, what is going to be the big thing that happens on my watch? And the first year it wasn't clear. That was just keeping things ticking over. And then I learned that WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, was getting an update. Some people call it WCAG, or I call it WebCAG. I think I'm the only person who pronounces it that way. I've included a few links for where you can find me here. These are links when I get the slides online. But the point is I've got different names on all the different places. So inconsistent usernames for the win. And so this is what we're going to talk about today. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines have been around since 1998. That was version 1. And even version 2.0 has been around since 2008. It's 10 years old now. So there is a plan to update the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, but doing a complete overhaul of it into a WCAG 3.0 is seen as a very ambitious plan. So as an interim measure, there's a WCAG 2.1. And it's likely there may be a 2.2 as well. That's mentioned at the W3C. So it isn't a grand overhaul. It's just an extension. And what it involves is, since 2008, the world has changed. Touch screens and mobile devices and small screens are now in all of our pockets. There's been a huge explosion in mobile. And so WCAG 2.1 adds more guidance for these areas. And it also expands some guidance about speech control and various cognitive disabilities, which it didn't make it into WCAG 2.0, or it wasn't clear exactly what the recommendations would be there. So this is an example of where it's expanded. It also, as well as just expanding WCAG, it does kind of attempt to fix a few shortcomings or gaps, really. An example of this was that WCAG 2.0 has a rule about focus being visible. It's essential for keyboard users that you can track where your focus has gone while you're tabbing through controls. But the success criterion focus visible didn't really say what qualified as a good focus style. It didn't really say how clear a focus style could be. And it could literally be a white page background and a really, really pale grey outline. And that would technically pass, but it wouldn't really be very clear or very useful for a user. And in another place, the WCAG 2.0 has some recommendations about color contrast, but this only applies to text. And so in WCAG 2.1, we have this thing called non-text contrast, and it attempts to plug both of those gaps. It makes it clear that icons, etc., now need to have a minimum contrast, or that if your buttons have a border around them and there's quite a lot of padding, the clickable space might be a lot bigger than the text, then you need to be clear about where the edge of the clickable area is, and that gets a new minimum contrast. And this also applies to state indication, like the focus rings, it's clear that those also have a minimum contrast. So this is trying to get around the problem where sometimes designers would come up with hover styles, which were a little bit subtle, but and then say, well, we never thought about focus styles. We'll just reuse the hover style. But subtle styles don't work very well for keyboard users. You need to have really obvious ones. That's an example of how it fixes some gaps in the existing recommendations. I've already said it extends it. What's interesting there is it retains exactly the same structure. It's still divided into 3 different priority levels. It's still structured according to general principles, operable, understandable, and then breaks those down into groups of guidelines, and then individual, the nitty-gritty, the individual success criteria. And the supporting documents have been extended as well. There's now a Understanding 2.1. It's a set of documents which explain in more detail with examples about what's going on with what the rationale is behind these new criteria. And just like the WCAG 2.0, there are details of techniques you can use and specific failures that you must avoid. And this is an overview of what's in there. Now, there's 17 new success criteria. And when I first caught wind of this in the very first working draft, I think they were all at level A and AA. There weren't any AAAs in there. And there was more. There was something like 22 of them to begin with, but a few of them didn't achieve consensus, or it was difficult to describe them in a way that was really clear or was testable. An important thing about the success criteria is they should be testable by a human, because these will form the basis of an audit. And a good number of them changed their numbering or moved from one group to another, and some of them changed their priority levels. But this is what we've ended up with. 5 of them are coming in at level A, 7 at AA, and 5 at AAA. And I stress these levels because they are the way to prioritize things. And if you have an existing website or application, you might be confident that you've conformed well enough to WCAG 2.0, but when you're bringing the new success criterion in to address WCAG 2.1, you'll want to use these priorities. I recommend you use these priorities. And sometimes in client conversations or project conversations, there's one of these levels that never really gets mentioned. And you might be thinking that's level AAA, but actually the one I never hear about very often is single A. AAA gets mentioned all the time. Usually it gets mentioned in, oh, we don't have to do that, we can ignore it. But because conforming to AA includes all of the single A, I think we sometimes miss the distinction between A and AA. And when you're trying to bring new stuff in, or if you're there's a launch deadline coming up, or budget is running out, then the distinction between A and AA really matters. You should go for the A's first. And I also mentioned that because we're not going to get through all 17 new criteria in this session today, in this talk. So I'm going to focus on the level A's. I mentioned that the numbering was the same, that Principle 2 is operable, and they've added 2.5, the second number is the guideline level. They've added a whole new group, 2.5 input modalities. And this is about the fact that more and more different devices, more and more input devices, input methods are being used to control websites and applications, keyboards and things that pretend to be keyboards, speech control and foot buttons, everything like this. And I also mention it because there are 5 new level A criteria, but 4 of them are in this group. So another way to prioritize what you're doing is to say, let's look at the stuff in this guideline group, first of all. There's a couple of AAAs in here. There aren't any AAs. So I thought what we'd next do is go and see. These are the ones at level A. You can see the numbering. 4 of them begin with 2.5 point something. Those are the new input modality ones. And for each of these, I've got some kind of demo or a little brief discussion of the problem. And links to the deeper understanding success criterion. These documents go through the problem and demonstrate techniques or examples of situations. Now, the idea about character key shortcuts, quite a lot of applications have got these, things like GitHub, things like Twitter, things like Slack even, where there's a whole bunch of keys which are there, such as, pressing T and it'll open a new tweet dialog, and pressing M will open a dialog for a new private message. And I got this example from the understanding character key shortcuts. The audio quality on this video is quite poor, but I'm going to switch to it and see if we can demonstrate this video. What it is somebody has the Twitter UI, and they are using speech control. Their microphone is on and their speech control is running. And at some point they say the name James, and I want you to see what happens. They said the name James and a new message dialog appeared, and the letters E and S were inside the let's give me the proof. What happened was he said James, and it reacted to the M in James. It was interpreted as a string of key presses. And M in James made the new message shortcut appear. And the 2 letters after the M are the E and the S. And the video showed us that the dialogue popped up and the message began with ES. And this can cause all sorts of problems. So the recommendation is that you don't have single keys acting as shortcuts for controls. You should build them in a way that they require Control plus M or Alt plus M, which is much more difficult to accidentally trigger using speech. Or other options are to provide a way to turn them off completely, or provide a way for users to customize them. We'll move on. We're now into the input modalities thing. Now, pointer gestures, this refers to the fact that the number of pointers and the capabilities of pointers have now greatly expanded. We used to think pointers were just mice, typically, or perhaps a trackball. But the biggest change is that multi-touch, multi-point touch screens and also multi-point trackpads, such as, you might have an Apple Magic trackpad on your desk. And many applications now have lots of strange gestures. So many of them, 2-finger swipe, 3-finger swipe, 2-finger circle. My favorite is 2-finger Z, and eventually 2 fingers do get used in a different way. But we can't assume that everyone, can do these gestures. People may not have the right dexterity to produce all of the gestures. They may not have a device that's equipped with multi-touch. And so pointer gestures says you've got to be able to do this with a single pointer. It's a big thing now in WCAG 2.1. We have to make sure that our websites work for mouse users. Surely, though, everything works with a mouse. Well, I'm not so sure. I tried to think a little bit more about how this might work. Could we contrive something that would exclude a mouse user? Now, this is briefly mentioned in the understanding document, but I've come up with a bit of, this is fake code, by the way, but I was thinking about slideshows, content sliders, and there's lots and lots, dozens, hundreds even, of JavaScript libraries. And they all have different options, but they all take some kind of JavaScript configuration, which looks roughly like this. Now, this is a completely made-up example, but we're talking things like jQuery cycle, I might say flex slider or slip carousel. They all try to be a kind of a one-stop shop. They're a JavaScript library where you can configure lots of different varieties of slider. So I thought here, what if we were to say, we'll enable the option which lets touch swiping work, so people can see the slider, get it to work on the phone easily. We know that people use the keyboard, so we'll enable the arrow keys, but we don't want any visual clutter, so we're going to disable. We're not going to have any previous and next buttons. And sometimes the sliders have little row of dots which indicate which slide you're on, and we're going to say that those aren't clickable. Now, looking at that, I think we might just exclude a mouse user from being able to operate on that. If the touch swiping actually used JavaScript touch events instead of a JavaScript drag event, then it might exclude them. And we certainly haven't got the useful buttons that are easy to click on. So that's, I don't know. I need to go looking at some of the real life JavaScript libraries and see if there's a way you can actually make a slideshow that just does not work for a mouse user. But this is what that pointer gestures is about. And then pointer cancellation is another one. There's this little quote. There are some persona quotes in WCAG 2.1, which says, you've got two buttons next to each other, and you just hit the wrong button by accident. Well, if you were to use your mouse, it is possible that you can click in the wrong place, but sometimes JavaScript makes the button activate when you press down on the mouse, and sometimes it activates when the mouse button comes back up again. And so the techniques for this problem are they recommend using the up events in JavaScript instead of the down events. The reason for this is if you can press down in the wrong place, well, whilst you've got your pointer pressed down, you can actually move it away from the button before releasing it. And if you do that, you can avoid pressing the wrong button, essentially. How to actually go about addressing that in your code, you should avoid using the down events, but if you've already got an application, this is what we're doing in Drupal, is we're just looking for every single instance of a down event and saying, can we swap this to an up event? And will everything still work? Number 2.5.3, label in name. The previous two were about pointer users, but this one is about speech control users. When you're using speech control, you might see something on the screen. It has a recognizable icon or a piece of text, like this button. We'll see a button with the words sign in. But you can see here there's an ARIA label for the button, and the ARIA label is login, and that's a mismatch between login, sign in. If you say sign in, it won't work. The accessible name should be in the actual rule is that the words sign in should appear in the accessible name. It could be sign into your account, that's the real name, and sign in is the abbreviated name that you see visible, but the exact phrase sign in must be in the accessible name. There is another example of this, which I found on a blog post somewhere, explaining this in more detail. Sometimes we have a button like this, and it might be a shopping site, and there's a load of products, and for every product there's an add to cart. But when you have lots and lots of buttons and they've all got the same text, a screen reader user might have difficulty confirming they've got the right button. So we've made the buttons all sound different to a screen reader user. We've put a visually hidden piece of text in to make it clear we're adding bananas to the cart or adding apples to the cart. But the way this is made, if you look at this visually, it says add to cart. But the actual name of this thing is add a kilogram of bananas to cart. And if you just say click add to cart, it won't work because the speech control is looking for a control with the phrase add to cart in it, the exact phrase add to cart. How do you get around this? Well, one way will be to have reorder the contents of that button. So it said add to cart, brackets, 1 kilogram bananas. It might sound a little bit less elegant, but then you would, that might be a compromise you need to make to be able to help screen reader users and help speech control users. What's next? And this is the last of the level A thing, motion actuation. This is the idea that some handheld devices, tablets and phones especially, have a great array of sensors in them. Specifically, they have gyroscopes and accelerometers, so they can detect motion. This enables you to do things like change the orientation of your device, and the content moves on screen from a landscape to a portrait mode. It also allows you to do things like shake my phone or squeeze my phone. But all of these things kind of assume that you're holding it in your hand, and that's what we can't assume. There are lots of cases where someone won't be able to mount their phone. Typically, it's mounted in a stand. It might be there because you've got it on a wheelchair arm, and you're using a simple switch control to, switch on your foot, or a switch on your headrest, or something like that, or a switch on your cheek, or a mouth switch, any kind of switch. But you're not actually going to touch your phone. You might be using speech control, and you certainly can't shake it. It's locked in place. The same is true of a phone that you might have on your desk. If it's slotted into a charging dock, it's you don't really want to have to pick it up in order to shake it. You want to leave it in the dock. So the idea here is that you can't assume that someone's able to shake their phone. You've got to make sure whatever you can do with that, you can do it another way. And the simplest thing is just give it a button. And that actually concludes a brief run-through of all of the level A criteria. I'm going to just go and find the old slide. These are the ones we've just looked at. We looked at not having character key shortcuts. The example there was someone, speech control accidentally interpreted speech as character shortcuts and opened up a dialogue. The pointer gestures, that's about the fact that you might not be able to use multi-touch, or you've got to be able to use it with a single mouse pointer. Pointer cancellation, that was I don't want to hit the wrong button. Use the JavaScript up events, gives you more opportunity to avoid that. Label and name was for the speech control users to make sure there's no mismatch between the official name of a control and what's actually displayed on screen. And motion actuation, don't rely on someone being able to shake their device or hold their device. And if I just go back, we were very much at the end of my slides. These are all the other ones at level A and AAA, and you can see their numbering is all over the place. Their orientation don't require it to be portrait versus landscape. There are things about identifying purpose. That's about putting metadata in so that the machines can understand the purpose of some controls. I've mentioned non-text contrast already. There are some stuff about the way that spacing and flowing of text works. Animations, having target size, that's about having big enough buttons that they're easy to hit. Content on hover or focus, that's about things that pop up when you're hovering, and they sometimes get in the way of other content. What I thought we'd do now, Carrie, how's my time?
You can have as much time as you want. If you want to demo something in particular, we have a couple questions if you'd rather go there first.
Great. I was aiming for half an hour, and I think I've more or less done it. Well,
Mhm.
my last slide is, well, now it's conversation time. I have no particular plan at this point. I do have, you can open it up to questions. Carrie says there's a couple. But other things we could do, there are things at some of those level A and double A, triple A and double A criteria, which we could demonstrate. Or we might discuss, how are you going to do this for your own websites? And I've spent a lot of time thinking about what we need to do on the Drupal project. Carrie, can I go over to you and find out what the questions are?
Sure. I'm going to mute you here. Let's claim as host. I'm getting a little feedback, so I'm just going to mute you while I ask some questions, and I'll put myself on mute, flip it back. So one question I got already was about how these new updates, what do they mean for the 2.0 version of the WCAG guidelines? There's also the question about how that changes, if it does at all, any other kind of compliance like 508s.
Oh yeah, I think I know what you mean here. So WCAG 2.0 is still a thing that you can say we conform to WCAG 2.0, or our conformance target is WCAG 2.0 level A. I think at this point it's worth saying I'm not a lawyer. More worth saying I'm a developer. That means I'm not a compliance officer. But whether you need to specifically go for WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1, different jurisdictions around the world, Europe or Australia or Canada or the United States, various of them require, mandate the use of WCAG for certain classes of website, typically government ones and education ones, or other public sector stuff. But so if you're worried, hang on, WCAG 2.1 is out now. Does this mean suddenly my websites are not considered conforming anymore? I'd say relax about that for the time being. If you're confident that you've addressed WCAG 2.0 at whatever level you targeted, let's say AA, then you're okay. You're still, your website hasn't changed. You still have that level of conformance. What we're doing in the Drupal project is we have what's called the accessibility gate. That's kind of like our quality control policy, as it were. And we aim to target WCAG 2.0. I don't think we absolutely promise it, but that is our target. Some things aren't in scope for us for Drupal core, but as best we can, we address WCAG 2.0. Now that WCAG 2.1 is out, our QA gate still says WCAG 2.0, and it will do for a little while yet. The way I'm seeing this is that now that WCAG 2.1 is finalized, we're working towards WCAG 2.1 conformance, and at some point we'll update the wording of our policy, but for the time being it still says 2.0. And when we've got when we've got enough coverage of 2.1, then we'll raise the gate behind us. That's how I've been thinking about it. We'll achieve 2.1, and then we'll go and make that formal. I guess sooner or later, jurisdictions around the world will update from 2.0 to 2.1, but when that happens, I don't know yet. We can't be sure.
Okay. It looks like we have a question from Kiwi here. We're talking earlier about one of the examples that you showed. If you just swap down events for up events, then don't you run the risk of accidental triggering? For instance, say I start clicking on a button and then realize I don't want it, so I move my mouse pointer off the button and it happens to land on a different button. I don't want to trigger the other button.
Yeah, so you can, I think it might be easier if I actually demonstrate this on a real kind of website. I'm going to kind of slightly drop out of my slideshow and move to a web page. This is the web page where where I've been tracking what's going on with WCAG 2.1, which I started a good old year ago when the first draft was out. It's a big extended note to self, really. So I hope you can see my mouse pointer. Is that right? I'm in the middle here. Yes, I don't know if that sometimes gets taken out of a video stream, but when I hover over this link, it gets an underline. I'm under a little heading called Confirmed New Criteria. And then below it, there's a list of all the criteria, and each of those, I've made them into links. Now, if I press down on my mouse button down I've got a laptop, by the way, which still has separate buttons. Sometimes you click on the trackpad itself, but mine's a trackpad with separate buttons. I find it much easier. And if I click down on this, you've probably seen you might just be able to see, I'm going to make this bigger. If I zoom up a bit, this could be more fun. How's that? Nice big things. So I've got this list of links. I can hover over one, and if I touch down on it, a focus outline has appeared, and I didn't mean to click on reflow. I meant to click on like non-text spacing. So I've still got my mouse button held down. I can actually kind of just go, it's actually treating it as a drag, but if I just go there, it's not allowing me to drag it. But the thing is, I've managed to escape. I haven't followed that reflow link. And now, more carefully, I can say content on hover or focus. That's the one that I wanted. So what's happening is you push down on the mouse button. No, that's not the one I wanted. Whilst I'm still holding it down, I'm getting out of the way. Now, if that's because the link doesn't actually work, I press down, and when I release up, that's when the link starts to work. In the bottom corner of my screen, you could see a little progress bar. Just do that again. I press down, and it's when the up event happens that the link activates. Let's go back. And again, if I press down, I say, I don't want to do that, get out of the way, I haven't done it. Here I'm not using any assistive technology, but there are some assistive things for this as well. You can get pointer devices where it locks it in the down position and then you specifically release it, so you don't need physical strength to ensure that you're still down. The iOS operating system has a thing called touch accommodations, which allows a delay before it registers the down event as well. So that provides another way of getting out of the way. But if something happened immediately on the down, you kind of can't get out of the way. There is another way of looking at this. I'm going to find the document. A couple of my slides. It was Pointer Cancellation. Might be worth reading the actual words of the thing here. For functionality that can be operated using a single pointer, then at least one of the following is true. Now, no down event is one of the ways to address this. And that's the one that I recommended. You can go through your code and look for mouse down and change it to mouse up. But there are other things as well. There is the idea that you could abort it or undo the event. So if a mouse down caused a dialog to pop up, well, if that dialog has a close button or a cancel button, then it'll qualify under the abort or undo. There is also a essential kind of exemption clause for this. So some operations do require the down event. So if you are building a JavaScript drag and drop system, well, the down event is something that you actually need to be able to pick up on. So that might be a thing that can be exempted. The understanding documents are really good because they give you a whole bunch of explanations of the benefits or more idea about what the techniques are, examples of scenarios, nitty-gritty of the techniques. Here we go. Touch events are only triggered when touch is removed from a control. If we follow that, we'll end up getting much more detail about implementing it. And a failure. Failure due to activating a button on initial touch location rather than final touch location. So there's more detail for you to look at there.
All right, so I muted him again. Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for that. I put both of those links, the Drupal project and the WCAG 2.1, Understanding the Pointer Cancellation, links in the chat window. We'll repost those again on the YouTube channel. So it looks like we have another question from Julian Powell. Do you know which automated testing tools are likely to support testing for 2.1? And I'll add on, do you have any idea of how long that would take to implement?
No and no, but I have thought about it. I was thinking for instance, there's one of them here called target size. The way that target size is, I'll just get the definition open. The way that target size is phrased is that the target for pointer inputs is at least 44 by 44 pixels. Now, this is talking about buttons and things. We want them to be nice so that they're, easy to hit. If you're having difficulties being accurate with a mouse pointer, then bigger targets make it easier. Now, some of the current generation of accessibility testing, automated testers, I might mention the Axe core or some of the things that are built into browsers or the Tenon API service. They're all running on JavaScript. Now, JavaScript there is ways in JavaScript where you can identify an element and get its computed size after all the CSS has been applied, and it's got things like padding and stuff. You can use JavaScript to actually query what is the size of this button after all the styling's been applied. And so I think if the current tools can go through and they can certainly find controls that are inputs or buttons or links, or even if it's a div that just happens to have a click handler, if you can identify those, then the next step is to use JavaScript to query how big it is. So I think you could automate target size as a check very, very reasonably. I wonder if there's any others I've thought about. Orientation might be testable. The idea about orientation is you can't assume that someone is going to be able to rotate their phone. If someone's using a phone in it's mounted, on a dashboard or a wheelchair arm or something, and they're not able to turn it. Well, if you've got an app that relies on it being landscape, or vice versa, that's what this criterion is about. Say, don't actually change it. Now, orientation changes do fire a JavaScript event. When you have your phone in your hand and you move it, the JavaScript event system picks that up and you can react to that. Now, it maybe some JavaScript testing tools could simulate that, could fire orientation events and get some kind of simulation. And I guess what we'd be looking for is is some essential control now? Have you, if you've done things like disabled scrolling or used fixed positioning on elements and stuff in an application, and you're assuming it's portrait and someone changes it to landscape, you can say, hang on, is there a fixed position thing which is now no longer in the viewport? I think some of these things might be testable automatically. We'll see what happens with those. I think identify purpose, the idea, there's two of them here at different levels. The idea about identify purpose is that you have machine readable metadata. So I guess that can certainly be detected by automated testers. Whether it's correct, like you've got a text field and it says it's a password, but it's not actually a password. You could fire up warnings about these, probably. Content on hover or focus. This is about where things like balloon help and tooltips and things, where they actually go. You could probably use JavaScript to query like the actual location and coordinates and then say, is there anything else underneath that's been obscured, and simulate an escape key press to see if you can dismiss the dialog, the tooltip. Some of that could be automated. It's early days. I don't know what anyone has planned to implement. I don't know, maybe the open source ones like Axcore, you could actually go looking for some of this in their issue queue and see if it's come up yet.
Yeah, I imagine that it's similar to sorry to cut you off there, similar to other automated testing tools where I'm guessing they want to automate as much as possible, but just realizing that automated testing still catches around 20 to 40% of the errors on your page. So you still have a huge chunk that needs to be caught manually. Any more thoughts? Any more questions for Andrew or anything you want him to demo?
It might be worth saying which ones I've got some demos prepared for. I've got demos of non-text contrast and text spacing and content on hover or focus and target size. Those are things I could demonstrate on real-world websites.
Why don't you pick one? We have a few minutes left.
Okay, my favorite one then, out of all of the new criterion, is non-text contrast. I mentioned non-text contrast because I don't enjoy using a mouse. I'm capable of using a mouse, but if I have to use a mouse all day, I will get a sore hand by the end of the day. So I kind of fit the mold of a keyboard-only user, and I really enjoy websites that have got good focus styles. I'm capable of using a mouse. I'm just grumpy when I have to. So I have a demo. I've got a little folder full of, something with my...
And if you have time to, Andrew, Steve would like to see a demo on text spacing if you have that too.
Yeah, that's a really quick one to do. So I have some notes. Example of non-text contrast. These screenshots I have are actually part of it. There's a... let's go to a new website. There's a tool that I like to use in my development work. It's called Doxel, and it's just a way of running virtual machines using Docker, and it's a thing that's really popular with developers for their working environment. I picked it because they actually launched a brand new refresh of their website, and they did that this week. And so I went and had a look at it, and I found a bunch of things which don't actually pass non-text contrast for WCAG 2.1. The first thing I'm going to direct you to have a look at is we have this navigation menu. It says WCAG, OS support, boilerplates. And we can see that one of them has got, it's on this grey background, but one of them has got a slightly paler, almost white background to it. I think that means, that's the active current section that you're on. And sure enough, if you hover over these things, you can see that they get a slightly darker grey background, and that is that's something where it isn't going to pass. The difference between the background colour of boilerplates and install Doxel isn't so strong. It will be a stronger style for hover if it kind of drew a border around the thing that you're hovering on. How does it look with keyboard navigation? Fine, it looks okay with keyboard navigation. What I'm seeing here is that they haven't suppressed the default browser style. This is Firefox. I'm seeing a 1 pixel dotted outline. Is it dotted? I think it's dotted. Further down the page, a few things. When we get to the footer, it's in this wonderful sort of salmon pink color. Now, first thing to say about this is that the text here isn't sufficient contrast to pass WCAG 2.0. I measured this pink background and the slightly paler pink text, and it came out as 1 to 2.9 was its contrast ratio. It doesn't pass. It should be 1 to 4.5. But for non-text contrast, look at this link down here. It says the Doxel blog. It's got a hover style. But looking at this, there's a lot of padding on this link, quite an extra bit of above and below, and even more at the sides. And the entire extent of this area is the target area, rather than having to hit the text. But what this has failed on is we can see that we have a pink background page, and then the link has a border around it in a kind of pale pink. And so what we're looking at is the contrast between this deep pink background color and this 1 pixel, or is it 2 pixels, this thin border. We want to know if that thin border has enough contrast. I did measure it. It was slightly less than 1.2. So slightly less than 2 to 1 contrasts with the deep pink background. The requirement is that where you're showing a border around something, it needs to be 3.1. And so this one doesn't pass that. There's another thing you can do as well that I looked at with these buttons here, the social media links. Let's just get into the browser tools, put that down in the bottom there, and scroll again, and computed. And what this is doing, I've got the piece of the browser tools which gives you the dimensions of the thing. So I've zoomed in on it, and we can see that this thing is 58 pixels square. So there it actually passes. Am I at the correct zoom? Yes, I'm at the correct zoom. So 58 pixels, the requirement for target size is 44 pixels. So these pass, and that's literally how you assess it. You go in and find these this tool on the on the right hand side, which tells you how big that is in pixels. There you go. That's 2 demonstrations in one. Back to my thing. The other one that was to demonstrate was the text spacing. Was that right?
Yes.
Yeah. This came up on Twitter a few weeks back. We'll read what it says about text spacing first. Text spacing. Jack up these. Oops, what have I done? Right. Text sizing. In blah, 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 blah. Basically, now the wording of this is careful. in languages that support the following text properties, and CSS supports them all, no loss of content or functionality occurs if you set them to those sizes. What this is not saying is that you must use line height 1.5 and text spacing 0.12. Rather, what it's saying is that if a user has like a browser add-on that lets them jack up the letter spacing or jack up the line spacing, then when they choose to jack up the line spacing, it shouldn't break your functionality. What's going to happen with this is if you've got something like a grid of cards which show products, things like product name and product pricing, an add to cart button, whatever you've got in there. If someone decides that they need to have more letter spacing and they jack it up, it's going to change the spacing of the layout. Now, if you've got these cards and you've said that they're a particular fixed height and you're hiding the overflow on them, it's possible that increasing the spacing means that you'll no longer be able to read some of it. So you can't read it when it's small, and when you space it out, some of it's completely missing. There is a tool, a cool tool, which I found. Here it is. Short note, from the Paciello group, Steve Faulkner's blog post. He published this a few weeks ago. When was it? Oh, middle of May. And what he did was he made a bookmarklet, and I've actually got it in here. Text spacing all the way down here. If I click on this, watch very carefully what happens to the text. It all got bigger. Well, it didn't actually get bigger. It just got more spread out. And so what this little bookmarklet does, you can put this in your own browser toolbar. It has gone through and made all the line spacing 1.5 times the font size. And it's made the letter tracking and the word spacing. It's jacked all the spacing up to those levels. It's not saying you should have that spacing on your website. It's saying when a user deliberately jacks it up, nothing should break. This is all fine. We can still read everything. Now, but if you had some like a Twitter card or something like that, I don't think it's changed it. This stuff's inside an iframe. It hasn't changed the stuff that's inside the iframe. And the idea is that, if this was a fixed height and you had constrained it and hidden the overflow, some of that text might be cropped. That's what breaking the functionality or breaking the content, loss of content or functionality. That's what they mean. If it's been chopped off after the spacing's been changed, then that's a fail. We can look through the understanding that document, and we've got more detail about the intent, author responsibility. The criterion does not dictate that they must set their content to that size. Rather, it says an author should be allowed to do it. A user should be allowed to do it. There's some research background to it. I'm going to ignore that. And a bit of testing about how you can look at this. Oh no, that's part of the research. My mistake. Right, so here's the example. Someone has jacked up the spacing, and because there's a card, the has been constrained, and now everything's all a bit overlapping. You can't actually really. That probably says you meet your needs, and you can't really read all the letters. A few more ones. Here we've increased the spacing. There's a few picture tiles, and where these arrows are pointing, we can see that the word wheel has been chopped off, back to the drawing board, I guess. But that's the kind of cut off, chop off, hide your overflow example of things breaking. Here, the spacing, jacking up the spacing has led to an overlap. and here's what we should have. Rather than constrain the box, we'll let the box grow around the text. There you go. There's your demonstration. Do go and read the understanding documents, because they really give you a lot more information than. But sometimes if you're using an automated checker, it just says failure of this, and you go, I don't understand. But you go read the understanding documents, and it'll explain it all better.
All right. Well, it looks like we're about out of time. Thank you so much, Andrew, for being our speaker today. I'll get these chat notes and all the links that you posted today up on our YouTube channel soon. So thank you.
Good. That was fun. Doing requests was a good way to test my knowledge. I enjoyed that. Thanks, everybody, for listening, for coming along and asking questions.
Thanks so much.